I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you this morning. Yesterday was actually the second World Usability Day to take healthcare as its theme. Out of only 7 World Usability Days so far that have had a theme at all. The other day I was speaking with a friend in the retail industry, and I mentioned this, and he was not happy. He said, "What? Healthcare is getting a second World Usability Day, and we haven't even had one yet in retail? How is that fair?" I tried to explain to him that there's a good reason for it. Let me just turn this on. In healthcare, usability can really be a matter of life and death. Or in between, it can be a matter between thriving and getting better and suffering and illness. So there's a good reason to give it more attention. But what is usability really? What's it really about? Originally, the first focus of usability was really on ability to use, because when we first were able to make systems that could do impressive new things with information for us, we were so impressed by what they could do, and also we were so early in the process of just learning how to make them, that we accepted it requiring a fantastically huge manual like this, or a fantastically long and expensive training program to get people even to just be able to use it. So making it intuitive so people could just look at it, kind of figure it out and start using it, was really the initial focus. But as I've suggested in the title of this talk, ability to use is really just the tip of the iceberg. But what is this iceberg? Well, it's really the inescapable humanness of technology. We tend to think of technology as something that's almost the opposite of human. It's made of hard stuff, not soft flesh. It's mechanical, it's robotic, it's not like us. But really, since we make it and we use it, it's actually imbued with humanness, because the thought processes, the emotions, the motivations, the views of the world and of the users in the people who make the technology shape the technology itself. And then when users use the technology, that affects how they think, affects what they feel and how they manage their feelings, and it certainly affects what they do. So if we look below the tip of the iceberg, what else is there here other than just affecting ability to use? One way of looking at it is in terms of different paths by which tech design can impact humans. Now, I've got the path to ability to use going down to the smiley smartphone. So that's the tip of the iceberg, and that's extremely important, as we all know. But then there are a couple of other paths that I'm going to talk about. First one is the indirect effect of ability to use. It's very obvious that we want people to be able to use technology, but there are some other things that consequences of whether it's easy or difficult to use, beyond just whether they can use it. So we'll look at that briefly. What I'm going to spend the most time on today is the top path, which I think of as a bit deeper in the iceberg. And that's where the tech design is directly affecting how people think, their cognition, what they feel or how they process their feelings, and their behavior in ways that aren't really anything to do with ability to use. But first, let's look at indirect effects of ability to use. This is a study that's mentioned by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And both of these statements are in fact incorrect. But what was found in research is that the one in bold, people will tend to think it's more likely to be true. And you can switch which one's bold. It doesn't matter. The bold one's a little easier to read. And at some unconscious level, your brain somehow makes that, or translates that into, this seems more likely to be true. So think about this in a healthcare context. An example that comes to mind for me is when I go to the doctor with my daughter who's 5 years old. I'm always given some handouts, and they say like normal development for a 5-year-old, and what to do if she has a fever, how much Tylenol to give her. And they tend to be on what seem like 10th generation photocopies. They're kind of murky, sideways, on an angle, just not very attractive to look at. And normally we would think of that as just an aesthetic issue. We'd think, well, sure, it looks ugly, but it's, in practical terms, what difference does it make? It gives you the information you need. But what studies like this suggest is that making something easy to process can have much deeper impacts than that. It may affect whether people, firstly, whether they read it at all, but if they do read it, how authoritative they take it to be, whether they actually follow the advice, and whether they trust the person who gave it to them even. So ability to use can have much more of an impact than just whether you can use something. But now let's look a little deeper in the iceberg. First, let's look at effects on thinking. Now this slide needs some explanation. It's the jar represents a statistical fact about a population. So let's suppose, to make up a fictitious disease, orange plague. Sounds scary and probably none of us want to have it. But in this jar, the orange marbles represent people in the population who are unfortunate enough to have orange plague. And the other marbles represent everybody else. Now, if you just give people statistical information about the population like that, we all interpret that quite naturally correctly. We think if we close our eyes and reach into the jar, pull one out, we have a good sense of how likely it is it will be an orange one. Where trouble comes in is where you need to combine information about a population with specific information about an individual case, which is, of course, very common in healthcare because there are population statistics about prevalence of diseases, and then there's all the individual information for diagnosing a particular patient. So let's suppose you go to the doctor and you get a test for orange plague. And this test is 95% accurate. It's only wrong 5% of the time. And it says you have orange plague. Well, the doctor tells you that. And the doctor also mentions, you know, this is a pretty rare disease. Only 1 in 1,000 people has orange plague. How worried are you going to be? Well, studies gave this kind of task to students at Harvard Medical School. And almost 50% of them said, well, now that I've got the test results, it's 95% likely that this patient has orange plague. They didn't use orange plague, but some other disease. And the average response was around 50% of the probability. The correct answer is under 2%, because the population base rate of only 1 in 1,000, you have to combine that with the error rate of the test. And when you combine that properly, the overall probability that this patient has orange plague, given the positive test result, is actually under 2%. But people have a great difficulty combining that kind of information. Intuitively, we don't do it well. However, there are things that can help. And so my point here is that we need to know that these kinds of ways we think don't always work out in the best way, and we need the technology to actively help us to make better judgments. And one simple way that can be done, that's been found in another study, is just telling people, think like a statistician. They gave the same task to different groups, and some of them they told them, think like a statistician, and others they told them, think like a clinician. Thinking like a statistician made them quite a lot more accurate, and actually thinking like a clinician was the opposite effect. It made it even worse. Which, if you think about it, makes some sense, because we tend to think of clinicians as people whose job is really to focus on an individual patient and figure out what's true about them. You think maybe an epidemiologist thinks about the whole population, but a clinician should really be focused on me as a patient. I don't want them saying, well, you're just a member of a population. That almost could seem insulting. So here, in designing information technology that provides this kind of information to healthcare providers, combining even just a simple cue, like think like a statistician, some kind of reminder like that could be helpful. And then there are all kinds of other things that could be done that would be more complex. So those are some impacts on cognition, on how we think. Let's look now at emotion. Secondary traumatic stress, also known as compassion fatigue. So a serious problem for many healthcare providers who interact often with patients who either have had or are in the midst of very traumatic or experiences or extreme suffering. And this tends to rub off, the stress of that experience tends to rub off on the provider, and they can experience really significant problems as a result, including major depression, burnout. Now what's been found, according to Peter Huggard in an article in 2003, what can really help with this is early recognition of this emotional dynamic, so that the provider recognizes they're emotionally being affected by their interactions with patients, and they have insight into that. They can then have it rub off on them less if they're aware of it more early on. Now, if you just tell that to people, that might help a bit. But think about what technology could do. In every interaction, they're filling out a chart. They're filling out information about the patient. What if we take that and say, well, the purpose of this chart doesn't have to be just to keep records on the patient, it could also be to help the provider be more resilient. Perhaps just asking them a very simple question, what was the emotional impact on you of this interaction? Low, medium, high. Simple as that. Wouldn't necessarily have to have any follow-up, although it could. Maybe just being asked that routinely would help providers to be more aware of their emotions and have more insight into it right at the time that it's just happening, or it's just happened. So without actually trying this and doing research to validate it, we can't be sure it would help, but the point is the technology provides opportunities to help providers manage their emotions in ways that could really have a significant positive effect. And now let's look at behavior. Obviously, the behavior of healthcare providers and patients is very critical to healthcare outcomes. Here's an example I found recently. A study out of Johns Hopkins studied the emotional rapport of primary care physicians with their patients and found that when the patient is overweight or obese, their emotional rapport is much less good than with other patients. And this was done by, I think, videoing the sessions or something, having people rate them who didn't know about the patient. Now this study just found that this is the case. It didn't find out why. But now that we know that this is the case, and if you think about it, this is a really pretty serious problem. We've got a lot of people in the population who are overweight or obese, and we all need good emotional rapport with our doctors. And probably more than ever, if you're struggling with weight issues or health, difficult diet or health issues. So doing something to address this problem would really be important. So first we need to find out what's going on here. Why is the rapport less good? And social psychology could help us with that. It could suggest ideas from theory and then suggest ways that we could validate that. Let's suppose, just as an idea, let's suppose what was found was that the providers feel uncomfortable because they feel some kind of conflict between their role as a doctor, where they think that they ought to bring up this issue of obesity and weight and health with the patient, but they feel like if they do, they're going to be offensive, so the interpersonal interaction is just uncomfortable for them because they feel like they either will be sort of a rude, obnoxious person, or they'll be a bad doctor, and they're sort of caught in between. Now that's just an idea off the top of my head, but that could be validated. We could find out what's really going on. Once we found out, technology would be the perfect way to deliver help just in time. Rather than, say, sending doctors off to a seminar about how to relate to obese patients, you could, or in combination with that potentially, but the technology already has the patient's height and weight in it, so it knows their BMI, and it could just, only when it's relevant, it could pop up some little very discreet but helpful reminder about, say, a way of reframing the interaction, or just a phrase that can be a helpful way to interact with the patient in a way that's respectful and yet addresses the issue of their weight. Just an idea, these are 3 examples I've given you for direct impact of tech design on cognition, emotion, behavior. And I want you to remember that these are just examples to illustrate that there's a very rich range of things that we could do in this area if we look at it this way. If we look at technology not just as something to do functions for us, to manage data for us, and to streamline workflow processes, but look at it as something that actually is fundamentally human, interacting with the patients and the providers, and that we can make the way the patients and the providers function themselves, we can support them in functioning better. So what's the take-home message that I want to leave you with today? I like to think of an analogy between what we all probably agree about the best doctors, and then think about how that applies to the best healthcare technology. Best doctors, I think probably most people would agree, don't just mechanically diagnose illnesses and prescribe treatments. They form a relationship with their patient that has a positive influence on how that patient thinks, how they manage their feelings, and particularly on how they behave, like following the treatment suggestions, improving their health qualities of their lifestyle, and so on. So similarly, the best healthcare technology doesn't just perform functions, it actively seeks to positively influence not only ability to use, so that it doesn't get in the way, but that it takes advantage of all the opportunities that its interactions with its users provide to support more positive cognition, emotion, and behavior. So some of you might be wondering, well, this is all very well, but what can I do about it? I'm not in charge of the design of most technology. Well, there are really lots of things you can do. Some of you may actually be in charge of the design, and then you can really do a lot. But what I'd like to leave you with here is that behind this is a way of thinking about technology. And if we continue to think of technology just as sort of mechanical tools that do things, and maybe we kind of want them to be easy to use, but that's about as far as we get in acknowledging how human they really are, then we'll continue to do things the way we've been doing them. But if we really take on this understanding that technology is about humans, it's not really about bits and pieces and bits and bytes. If you notice that in your observations and you think about it and you talk about it in particular with colleagues, and my exclamation point here is to point out that the more you can be willing to stick your neck out a bit or rock the boat a little bit and maybe pose surprising questions or question the status quo or some assumptions, particularly about the tendency to view functionality as really what it's about and usability and other things as sort of an aesthetic nice to have, then the more impact you can have. And then the hand here represents, whenever you have an opportunity to take action and help improve the situation. So I really appreciate having had this chance to talk with you. I'm really looking forward to hearing all the other talks. And if any of you have any follow-up questions that you don't get a chance to ask today or comments that you'd like to share with me, I would be very glad to hear from you. My phone number and email are up here. And I could give you my card later if you approach me. But I'm looking forward to the rest of the talk.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent start. Just going to take a moment.